figuratively today, both. We are moving on from the ancient world into what is known as the medieval world. I doubt this is spelled correctly. Don't make fun of me for doing it. The medieval world, which it's a term that has a specific European context. It was really coined by Renaissance scholars. They tend to call this period the Dark Ages, which you gotta appreciate the perspective here. Renaissance scholars, people from the Renaissance, who we'll get to eventually, decided that, well, what made them particularly great as Renaissance scholars was that they were developing an appreciation for and reinterpreting and revaluing the learning and the culture of the ancient world. So they said, we're great because we understand that the ancients were great, and everything in between was just sort of, embarrassing, worthless. And for all those hundreds of years, nothing of value happened. Hence, the Dark Ages. You can see the chauvinism in that regard. Currently, for the last several years, I'll just keep it vague like that, there's been a resurgence in scholarship focusing on this era, and, son of a gun, it was a little more sophisticated than people think. It was not just a lot of crudity. There was actually a fair amount of highly sophisticated art and thought being developed. Of course, to understand the culture of the Middle Ages, you really kind of got to go back a little bit to understand how it was beginning. It begins really with the end of the ancient period, which in European terms generally gets equated with what is known as the fall of the Roman Empire. This is the Roman Empire. This is the Roman Empire at the point of some of its greatest height. A little hard to see. I pulled down the thing, but I don't want to. You can see, pardon the fact that all the place names are in Latin, you can see Rome at the center was running everything. And all of these lines are roads and trade routes. Rome was famous for building roads. You ever hear the phrase, all roads lead to Rome? That's because they did. Rome liked building roads because roads could be used to transport goods. Roads could be used to connect cities to one another and connect them back to Rome itself. And that comes in really handy when you are sending soldiers this way and that way to control your empire, which I think we can all agree was a pretty hefty chunk of real estate. North Africa, the Middle East, Southern Europe, all over the place. North of here, the Germans. Barbarians. The word barbarian actually comes from Latin because they felt that the Germans, for whom that word was created, When they spoke, everything they said tended to be chaos. Bar, bar, bar. I don't know, that's an anecdote. Actually, I think the word might go back before then, but it's funny. Keeping all this together took an awful lot of administrative skill, took an awful lot of effort. Rome held it together for quite some time. Over the course of a few centuries, however, things start to fritter away. Empires rise, empires fall. What are you going to do? One of the outposts, and here I am going to pull this down. You can see, I'll pull it all the way, up here. The line between civilization and barbarism snakes right through mainland Europe, separating the Germans from all the civilized folk. And then up here, the Romans made it all the way to England. England was kind of the far outpost of civilization, if you could even call it that much. The conquest of Britain by the Roman Empire was completed in the 1st century, roughly around 80 of the Common Era. London was the capital pretty soon thereafter of the entire province. And you can see this line up here was about as far as Rome cared to wander. England had a lot of grass, it had a lot of sheep. That's pretty much it. The people who were living there, known as the Celts, had, by Roman standards, a fairly barbaric way of life. They were not particularly literate. They didn't have a lot of writing. They had a rich oral tradition that people are only now starting to clue into, but it wasn't the high watermark of European culture. The line separates Scotland from England. And the Scottish, to this day, are rather proud of their rejection of those fancy pants Romans. You gotta love the Scots. I believe their national animal, according to my kids, they have a national animal or something like that, is a unicorn. It takes some moxie to say that. But over time, as all empires learn, as the empire starts to contract, it's the provinces that fall off the map first. England was worth something, but not much. They start backing out in, 410. It's effectively free and on its own at that point. In the wake of that, I love this. One historian says that England went through what this historian called radical economic simplification. Just think of that. Radical economic simplification. Suddenly, nothing had any value. Everything was pulled out from under you. You went to bed and you had a nice house, you had, some nice things around, you had an economy that valued all of these things. You wake up in the morning, the economy is gone. Your house has no value anymore because there's no economy to place a value on it. Everything is back to, I got a chicken, what do you give me for it? A little traumatic. the next several hundred years are tumultuous. Once the Romans pulled out, who starts to move in? Germans. People from all over Northern Europe start moving over and saying, it's, pretty decent land. Good for some farming, tends to be a little rocky, but again, very good for pasturage. Sheep are very big in England. So there was something worth going over there for. At around the same time, a little bit after, this new trend, this hot new thing, starts catching fire, going viral, as they say. Christianity. The Romans had converted officially many hundred years before, but, the rule of Rome was generally fairly laissez-faire in terms of culture. And the Celts beforehand had a kind of paganism. Their own gods, their own beliefs. And it was fairly anathema to Christians. All of the Germans that had been moving in, also largely pagan. Not too keen on Christianity. Hibernia is Ireland, and that was just too weird for anybody. Nobody went near there. I think Dublin was originally an outpost, but it didn't hold. So you have these conflicting you have these conflicting social forces going on. You have radical economic simplification. You have the Celts. You have a remnant of Latin culture that's left over primarily in the churches and in the forms of government. You have all of these new people moving in from across Northern Europe, but now more and more from Scandinavia. These people go by many different names. They tend to be small tribes. We can generally, and we do generally, group them all under the title Vikings. I spent a fair number of time this past summer reading these Viking Sagas, geared primarily around the founding of modern Iceland. And great stuff. Really violent, very bloody. It's like a Tarantino film with snow. But basically, these people would get in relatively small boats, a small band of them, maybe only a couple dozen guys, all guys, and they'd sail from place to place. They'd find a river, let's say the Thames, and sail up it. Say, well, okay, this is a nice river. And, oh, look, there's a village over there. That's pretty. You got all the little houses, and, oh, look, they got a little vegetable garden there, and they're tending sheep. Nice little family, kids playing in the yard. That's lovely. Let's go ashore, kill all the men, rape the women, kill the ones we don't want to kidnap, take the ones we do want to kidnap back in the boat, steal everything, and burn whatever's left to the ground. And then we'll move on to the next town. It's a good strategy. Worked very well for a long time. Over time, however, these same groups, particularly with England, which was kind of in flux. France was a little better organized at this point, and they liked hitting the mainland. They had more money. at this point. France was a little more sophisticated. But they also had, you know, people who were going to fight back. England, right there, a little more disorganized, very little cohesive government that can repel a small force that moves very quickly and very decisively. But also, you know, Norway, Sweden, these places are cold. And in the winter, you got pretty much nothing to do but just sit and huddle together and wait for the thaw. All the rivers freeze up. But you go to England, it's still pretty chilly. I was wearing sweaters when I was there this past summer, but the rivers don't freeze. You can move around a little bit more. So they start staying, which they had never really done before. So now you've got more turbulence in the social fabric, or social order, if you will, of people coming in. Migrants, immigrants. What are you going to do? Several years ago, I had an uncle who never finished college, and I was encouraging him to go back. He had only a couple of classes that he had to make up, and one of them was English Lit 1 or something like that. And I told him, you know, go enroll, we'll just get you, you know, his other kids, his kids had gone on and gotten their degrees, and it was like, you know, you set a good example, go do this, and you'll feel better about yourself. And I said, I will help you, you know, we'll go over this stuff, and, you know, we'll do it. He said, you know, he's grouching, he's like, I don't want to do it, I don't want to do it. And the one thing he told me above all else, and this was many years ago, and really colored my interpretation for quite a while, he said, for God's sakes, I just don't want to have to read Beowulf. So I have that in the back of my head whenever I come to this. But that's really unfair. Beowulf is a peek into a very different world. And it's more familiar than we might think. In England, within the last 200 years or so, which by this scale is fairly recent, an archaeological dig found a collection of Viking or Germanic artifacts from roughly the same period as Beowulf appeared. It was on the east coast of England, little north of modern London, an area, I believe it's East Anglia. And what we know, and what Beowulf talks about at several points, is when a leader or a hero or somebody of some prominence died and they wanted to give him a proper burial, thank you. Well, there were two different ways that would go about it. One, the first one mentioned in the book, when the old king or leader's shield dies, they load him up with all of his treasure, put him on a boat, and sail that boat out into the sea, which, you know, will just drift around forever, sink, land on the luckiest guy in the world's doorstep, who knows. But that was one way. The other way was a burial mound, where they take all of this stuff, they dig a hole, they put all this stuff in the hole, and then they pile dirt on top of it, and you have, the result is a big, weird hill in the middle of what is an otherwise fairly unimpressive landscape. A mound, literally. They found one in East Anglia called Sutton Hoo. And it's really interesting stuff. Mostly weapons, But what they dug up was an entire ship. Somebody had taken an entire ship, dragged it up onto shore, put it down, loaded it with treasure, and then buried that. Now, for the most part, Viking ships, again, are not terribly large, so we're not talking, big. But still, it's going to be kind of heavy. So whoever had to pull that up did some work. But inside, weapons and treasure. This is probably the most famous piece. It's a helmet or a mask. Let's see if I can get rid of that. There. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, it's a helmet. It's for a brutal people to wear when they charge ashore and club people to their death. It's a weapon of war. And it is. And if you put the mask in front, yes, that protects your face, but it also makes you look, a little bit more menacing, a little less human. But look at the ornate details here. I love that this one has a mustache. Look at the ornate details, the design. That is not just protection at that point. That is art. That is somebody taking the time to say, this is valuable. This says something about me. Look at the detail. You can see this in the British Museum if you ever go to London. It's free. Go in and see it. The British Museum is, it's kind of chaotic. It's like every, it's like 1,000 yard sales just piled together. It's stuff the Brits have stolen from people from all over the world throughout many centuries. But included in it is this stuff, which they happen to own legitimately. And you can see all these weapons, and you get a sense that, okay, yeah, this is a very warlike people, a very brutal existence. This is what they value. But at the same time, there is room for some surprising sophistication, some surprising art, some sensibilities you don't necessarily expect from brutal pagan warriors.